Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Of God and Mind podcast. And with me here today, we have Jacob,
Hey,
Reggie,
Hello.
and Adam.
G'day, folks.
And today we are going to be discussing an article that you have probably seen around over this past week if you have anything to do with Christian circles or whatever. The Julia Baird article from ABC talking on domestic violence in churches. I'll link it below if you happen to have not seen it. But yes, I was actually a bit surprised at how much it stuck around and the controversy it created, but that's discussion for later on. For now, I'll pass it over to the rest of the guys here about what they thought of the article. And first, just a disclaimer, we don't actually have any Christian women on the show or even really conservative too much Christians. Me and Jacob sort of touched that area, but not so much there. So there's our weaknesses and biases there.
also no one's married,
This is true.
which is contextually relevant given that it's often domestic abuse within a married couple, I think is what we're looking at. Is that right?
I think so, yeah. Alright. So over to you guys. What did you all think of the article?
So, interesting thing, I actually don't think it's bad that an article was made. Now, I say that carefully in the sense that I fully believe churches should be held accountable to be transparent and not have or in any way I guess, punish victims of abuse and make it more difficult for them to talk. I think that's a fair thing to talk about. So and what I'm saying is that the topic isn't an off-limits topic to discuss or to write an article about. So at least I think that's fair. As we'll get into discussion a bit more about how they executed that, yeah, it's I think the interesting choices of titles, bylines, and the associated Bible verses were very poignant in sense that they, I think, were clear for Christians at least. Hey, yeah, these verses are taken out of context in the eyes of the abusers who are doing this. But I would have liked if the article was a little bit more, that on the way of saying with Christians also condemn abuse. Domestic abuse is not okay just because it's in a Christian couple in any sense. In fact, it's actually condemned by the Bible. Really hardcore. So,
Well, this is
yeah.
a series of, pieces about various religions on domestic violence. And I think the article is pretty well balanced, having a lot of, it's got a lot of anecdotes of experiences with the church and domestic violence. And there was one of the anecdotes, I forgot which one it was. I think it's the one about Sally, who was like, I never once doubted my belief in God. I was just disappointed in the church. So it's not necessarily hating on Christianity in general. It's just that was also, supportive of Christianity, but also highlighting, the need to discuss domestic violence and what the church can do.
Absolutely. I think, and that really highlights an issue with that particular congregation as well. In like, it's one of those things that when you hear the word church, are you talking about all a Christian community, or are you talking about a congregation? So just a congregation it might be one building's worth of people who make up the global church. So in a lot of these anecdotes, I think there's a lot of failings in these congregations which don't represent what the global church and what belief in Jesus actually stands for, which I think the article does pick up on. So yeah, like I say, it's fully fair to talk about and make an article on.
I guess my thoughts on it are that it, you could have written a similar article about other organizations, in that there's a lot of structural problems associated with the reporting of domestic violence. I mean, one of the issues that comes up in this article, as well as the one on Islam, is, I guess, perhaps predominantly male leadership, and even where the male leadership is well-meaning, they might not have the best awareness of how to handle domestic violence, or how to recognize it, or the tactics employed by abusers. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's essentially my thoughts. I can't speak to the specifics of being a Christian and my take on that, but one of the main takeaways from the article is that women either don't feel safe or don't feel comfortable reporting, or when they do report, they're rebuffed and told that, whether it be it victim blaming or whether they're just told it'll get better, but the handling of the reporting has been inadequate, which could be said for just said for society as a whole in general, really.
About a third of the way down, the subheading "The Abuse of the Bible," I think is a really strong point of the passage of the article. In that, I actually really think that's very well made. There's a lot of points there. Do you know if I briefly read 2 sentences out from the article?
Go for it.
So there is no mainstream, this is from the article, by the way, there is no mainstream theologian in Australia who would suggest that a church should be anything but a sanctuary, or that a Christian relationship be marked by anything but love. But church counsellors and survivors of family violence report that many abusive men, like Sally's husband, rely on twisted or literalist interpretation of Bible verses to excuse their abuse. To me, that's one of the, I say one of the because it's a very complicated issue, but I think it's one of the core, I guess, of the passage, of the article. It's really, me as a Christian, that's sums up a lot of what the article's getting onto.
So Adam and
So I
Reggie,
think
how
if
did
you-
you find the article sort of portrays Christians? What's the impression you get of churches and Christians from that article?
I don't see it. Like, I did see in some negative people, Christians, I should say, reacting negatively to the portrayal of Christians in the article. But in reading this, I mean, I've read similar accounts of, I guess, abuse, or be it domestic violence or sexual assault. And I guess I recognize that the issues in here kind of... The word that comes to mind is transcend. It's not quite the right right word, but the issues here affect many other groups. So the fact that such issues happen in churches isn't surprising, because such issues happen all throughout society. And I don't think the article was a hit piece against Christianity or Christians, because they made it quite clear that, speaking to those who know the Bible, that, the Bible doesn't condone abuse, and that Christians are, well-meaning and they want to help. It's just, I guess, there's a lack of awareness of what perhaps constitutes domestic abuse, or how to deal with it when it does happen.
Yeah. Some of the issues that were brought up in this article were also similar ones brought up in the article about Islam and domestic violence, which is about, misinterpretations of the Bible or the Quran, and abusers using that as an excuse to abuse. And then they have also similar issues of, imams or priests either encouraging women to stay in abusive relationships because various texts suggest that it's better for them, they'll have a place in heaven or be rewarded. There's a lot of parallels, but I think they do highlight the main issue being, the disconnect. Well, the lack of higher up females being in these religions, and it's being very male dominated.
Also, something I will say is we will be discussing the Christian passages used later on in this episode, and I'll probably actually just cut that out and use it as a separate episode too. So stay tuned for that if that's something interesting or useful to you. But yeah, so Jacob, you took it a little. You saw a little bit more of an attack in Christianity there, did you?
I didn't think it was much of an attack. I think it. In fact, like I said, I think the article was pretty fair, and there's some really good points there. Particularly, I think it really nailed that issue of that. It's, people using the Bible in the wrong, like complete misunderstanding what it's even trying to say. So I think I mean, I overall think it was pretty good. Like I said, overall think it was pretty good. There's some parts of it I think nice to hear, even from maybe some female church leaders, just to get a bit of a more encompassing voice, I guess, because there are a lot of female church leaders in a lot of churches. I mean, Baptist churches have some, and various other churches have female leaders, which I thought would be interesting to hear from. The article more. Also, there's a few somewhat outspoken male leaders that they chose from, like Kirk Cameron. I think they use quotes from and so on, which I think it's fair to use, but I don't think he represents all of Christianity. You know what I'm saying? It's some of the ones chosen, some of the also quotes chosen, which were made by people under the Christian banner. So I think they're fair to have. It would be good to have them balanced out by more, I guess, recognized voices on the matter, you know what I'm saying? Rather than more outspoken ones.
So my overall thoughts on the article are, I thought it was pretty good. It was nicely balanced. Like, it opens up with saying the Bible doesn't actually condone this stuff. You can't get this stuff. Well, you can get this stuff from it, but you can't. No one would go with it. When it's talking statistics, it mentions that while those with nominal association with conservative, it says Protestantism, doesn't it? With conservative Protestantism, have the highest rate of domestic abuse, above even people with no religion. The lowest rate is held by the regular church attendees from that same group, from the conservative Protestant churches. Probably my only complaint with it would be the unsubstantiated blame often laid at, well, not even blame, more the digs at sort of the, what's the way to call it? That it's related to things such as lack of female leaders and that the power imbalances are part of it, which for one is partly, we'll get into it later about headship doctrine and so forth, which is a lot of the debate on this, but the fact that the lowest account of abuse is by conservative churches who normally follow that doctrine discredits part of that. And while there are certainly factors such as it's a lot harder for a woman to approach a man about, like a male pastor, that she's being abused, I think these were probably said a bit more unsubstantiated than they should have been, which again is fair because um, it's like an opinion. It's not quite an opinion piece, but it's not a journal article, is what I'm getting at.
Well,
And
another
after
important thing to
hearing all the
realise.
stories that she's said, that she's heard, and going with her own, because it's worth noting also that she is a Christian, Julie Baird, from a more liberal background with, I presume, egalitarian style teachings. She's likely to have her own biases there, and after hearing the stories she's done, she's likely to be pretty mad at people.
Oh,
But
I don't think there's anything in the article worth being mad over. It's more like I honestly I think the article was, like I said, I overall think the article is a good one to have written. Actually, it's just like it as a Christian who's I guess really into being Christian, there are things which were a little bit better explained from the point of view of Christians. You know what I'm saying? Like the voice of female leaders in churches, and also maybe acknowledge some of those, particularly Kirk Cameron, and a couple as hey, they're not as encompassing of all the Christians' views on the issue. That's about almost just above halfway through the article. But overall, honestly, I think like I say, it's a very fair article to have written.
yeah, I'd agree.
I
Like,
find the statistic. Oh, continue.
like I probably came off a bit negative there, more than I seem to be, but I did really like the article, and as we'll get into, I think it's very important that it was written, and I think the response to it by a lot of Christians has been very bad. But we'll get back to that point in a minute. Go on, Reggie.
I was going to say, I find the statistic of it being I guess, the casual Christian having a higher tendency to be an abuser, like that was interesting. So it's like the people that attend church regularly, the ones that read the scripture and interpret it, they know about the context, I guess, they're more sound, they're balanced, compared to these casuals who just kind of are cherry picking what they want to believe. And that's just an issue in society in general. People find various excuses to believe in things, or misinterpret things. Like one example I can think of is theory. Like people choose to misinterpret the word theory instead of understanding it in its proper scientific context. But you can also say this about like other contexts where people cherry pick things. But yeah, that statistics of it's not all Christians. It's the casuals who are at a higher rate of being abusers. That was interesting to read.
All right.
Do you, I guess just quickly, though I don't know where this really slots in. A lot of the people, I did see some attacks on this, say criticism of the piece. Do you think it would have received the criticism it did had it come from another outlet? Like if it was the same piece, but say the ABC is seen by those more conservative or on the right as being varying degrees of on the left. And I guess in reality the ABC is possibly a little bit left-leaning, but it's certainly not far left. If this had been published in The Australian, for instance, do you think such people criticizing the piece would do it to the same degree, or are they purely criticizing the piece and the outlet had no factor in that?
That's an interesting one. So in terms of the outlet, like personally, I actually do like the ABC. I find most of the content pretty interesting, and at least they usually almost always have a good attempt at researching beforehand. And in this case, they did a 2-day research beforehand. Like ABC is known for their at least consistent putting effort into what they publish. I think it depends on what the other outlet was. Like if it was like a random blog thing or a relatively like opinion piece outlet, it may been just whatever, because there's plenty of opinion pieces that attack anything. Being the ABC, I think may have made some people who thought, hang on, this is like an official stance almost against Christianity, which I don't think the article's trying to make at all, actually. So I don't agree with the Christians just responding on, hey, it's anti-Christian, therefore it's evil. I don't think that's a fair criticism of the article or of
Reminder,
ABC.
it's part of a series.
It's part of a series, yes, part of a series. And that's another thing as well. Another thing as well is that there's a lot of reactionary reactions, which is like Reggie just
Reactionary
said.
reactions, you say?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, what I'm saying is, it's not like it's not like it's not like a lot of people commenting on the Facebook comments, particularly, and other commenting forums, have read everything in all the series so far, have then, reviewed it against their own set of beliefs, and have calmly thought of a response. I think most of the comments have been made rather quickly, or have skipped a few of those steps. Would you agree?
Yeah. Do you think there was some thought put into like the decision to publish the one on Islam first before the Christian one?
Yeah, I've thought the same thing. They're like, okay,
Yeah.
we can't lead with the Christian one, else everyone will just go, oh, this is the dumb anti-Christian police. Let's lead with the Islam one, that is a lot safer to bag out. Not that it's bagging them out, it's like, it's a lot safer for people to say bad things about Islam in the current climate than it is about Christianity.
It depends.
So you lead with that one, and then you can follow it up with your Christian one, and people might go, oh, well, they talked about Islam badly too.
Yeah.
I think it depends on which part of Australia you're in, whether it's actually safer to go Islam first or Christian first. I think in like North Queensland, I think Islam first and then Christian's probably the. Again, I'm talking about like publishing reaction, but it's very safe. But in some parts of Sydney and Melbourne, I'm not so sure.
It's still the safest way you can do it, I think.
It is.
I mean, you're talking about domestic violence, so you got women's rights in there, so you're not going to annoy liberals too much by having it in there. Like, there seem to be some people out there who think Islam has zero problems, but every ideology has its problems. But I think most people recognize that. Back to the outlet question, I think it probably has played a bit of a part. For example, one of the main shared counterpieces, so to speak, was Andrew Bolton, and I don't think he would have got involved.
You mean Andrew Bolt, not Bolton, Jesse.
Okay, Andrew Bolt. I was thinking, no, it's not Bolt. I've got it wrong. Let's just say Bolton. That sounds better. It's not Bolton. But I doubt he would have got involved, at least as vehemently, if it wasn't the ABC that he's got a bit of a bone to pick with. And I think a lot of just conservative commentators, or people not so much vested in Christianity, have kind of rushed into this because they're like, oh, well, this is just the ABC's next liberal agenda. But ultimately, you would have got a reception like this regardless, due to probably the main trouble. This leads nicely to the next point, actually. The main trouble with a lot of the responses, and one of the systematic issues we actually see throughout that's enabling this abuse, in that people seek to protect the church, protect the institution, protect our reputation above listening to what has actually been said. I will say though
that's actually a fair criticism. That's actually a really big issue.
Yeah,
because I don't think there's anything in the I don't think there's anything in that article that's anti-Christian. Like it might be, at most you could possibly get out like anti-structure or
establishment in a way,
and anti-church as an organization, but you don't get anti-Christian from it.
No, I agree with that.
Yet, like, I have the Andrew Bolt article open, which was published in the Herald Sun, and the first paragraph is, "What a coincidence. The ABC steps up its war on Christianity just as Cardinal George Pell returns to Australia to face court over alleged historical sexual offences."
Yeah, those two issues coinciding, like the cover-up of the abuse in the Catholic Church, is, yeah, like, I think most, if not all, churches would condemn the abuse that has happened, and like the fact that other like hid and covered up that sort of stuff, that hell related buggy, really is dodgy and it just undermines so much what the Bible stands for and says. It's really sad on so many levels, and it hurts the victims, families, and it helps follow the beliefs of the church of the Bible.
I mean, also consider that these articles are like an investigation for 12 months. This wasn't just something the ABC threw together over the weekend. Like this is a like long form investigative journalism, like speaking to those affected and seeking out those in churches to speak to. Not just a hit piece put together to continue the so-called war on Christianity.
So, yeah, back to the response. Now, I will say that it has been mixed, which has been good. Perhaps, like, I get a lot of this through the lens of my tailored Facebook feed, so there's a bias there. But I've probably seen about half of defensive, conservative rebuttals, or just outright missing the point articles, so I'll talk about that one later. And half of some really respected Christian guys. I'll name John Dixon and Michael Jensen, who also was the guy who spoke on one of the ABC reports on it. Not that there was actually much of interest in that little TV segment, but anyway. They have been out in defense of it and have said the useful things we need to learn from this, and John Dixon especially has been doing a lot of countering a lot of rumors, such as the fact that the ABC is anti-Christian. Well, the ABC posts more pro-Christian articles and just indeed general Christian articles than any other news outlet out there, for one. And there's a whole list of rebuttals to myths and so forth that come with that. But I will say I have been very disappointed with a lot of the reaction to it, where people are, well, they either feel the need to point out, oh, well, these are just, see, they've said, well, either they just take it as an attack, which is just kind of dumb, like, oh, the ABC just hates us, it's trying to get rid of us. But probably the worst are the sort of ones that perpetuate the problems you see in this article with things like, oh, well, it's the nominal Christians that do this, it's those who don't come every week and stuff like that. Therefore, they're not really one of us. This isn't really our problem. This is just a smear piece.
Nice, no true Scotsman happening here.
Yeah. Like, the majority of any church is going to be these guys, sadly. You have a lot more nominal members who aren't weekly, who don't attend the Bible studies and so forth, don't think too critically about the message you're giving and so forth. These guys will normally outnumber your regular Christians. They are very much a part of our church, and their wives, often themselves very devout, willing to stay in these situations, believing it's God, what God wants, are the ones who suffer from us going, oh, well, they're not really one of us. Not to mention the sort of message that throws to new Christians who just sort of come in and are still learning things when, oh, well, they don't come weekly for whatever reason. They're not really one of us. We'll just throw you under the bus as soon as it looks better for us to, for you to not be part of us. And ultimately, I think the biggest sort of takeaway from this message was that the church is, we're failing the vulnerable, those we're meant to protect. We're not listening to them, we're not believing them, and we're giving them advice that we think is good but is actually harmful and stuff like that. Though probably the biggest was no one in the church felt they could raise these things, because either they weren't in a church where they could ask people these sort of theological questions. They weren't in a church where they felt they could approach their pastor about the abuse they were facing, because they felt that the pastor would either support it or do nothing, which often happened, or even worse, the husband was a big part of the church, or even the pastor, and was the one doing the abusing. So we have some pretty big sort of systematic problems that the church has been perpetuating here, and I'll get on my thoughts on how to fix those in a minute. I want to try to make this talk as practical as possible. We're not just going to discuss all these events, but a lot of people just went straight into that defensive mode and ignored the victims, made it hard to talk about it, went straight back to defending their sort of theological pet projects, the male headship thing that we'll go back into soon. They just saw it as an attack and ignored the victims yet again, which is the worst possible way you could deal with this. A good example of this was the I always forget names when I need them. What's that one we mentioned earlier that talked to the
Dahlia's
abused
one?
husbands? The letter to abuse.
The
Letter to
Gospel
abusers?
Coalition of Australia.
What's the coalition? Yeah.
Yeah, that one. Which, like, I will say the article itself isn't bad. It does sort of mention. At first, when I read it entirely as a defensive piece. It's sort of this veiled, abusive husbands, we don't support you. Here's the reasons why the Bible doesn't actually support abuse. But it's on second reading, it does seem to be sort of genuine in that. But it's just such an example of the problem. It completely ignores the wives in it. It doesn't try and talk to the wives saying, hey, here's what these passages actually mean. They're being used against you wrong. You don't have to be here. You don't have to stay in this. You're not serving God by being in this relationship. It ignores them and talks to the husbands. And it just says, essentially, you're not one of us. Which is true in this case. You are not one of us when you do these things to your wife. You are not following the teachings of Jesus. You're not following the Bible. And like you're a disgrace. And you will pay for it one day. But just sort of
I feel that
so missing the
article-
point.
That article could have, it would have been, I think, I see much of the same problem in it as you did, but, is it both? I just want to make sure. Actually, no, it only seems to be the Christian one that has it right at the top. But in terms of the Christian article on the ABC, almost at the top of the article, there is family and domestic violence support services. And they list 5 different sources you can go to help, to receive help. I feel that open letter to husbands who abuse their wives, it does address the wives in the piece, so I feel it would have been, at the very least, improved a little, and it would have actually been somewhat helpful to the abused if it did contain links to resources for assistance, be it, definitions of what constitutes domestic violence, or better yet, helplines to seek assistance.
Or even like systems for the abuser. Like, I'm sure there's ones out there to help men sort of be counseled and reform from their abuse, to learn a different way
That's
to
true.
do things. Surely there's something like that out there that they could have linked in the article.
Because, by essentially just disavowing them, there are, I think the ABC article mentions it, that people who are abusers might just pack up, if confronted, they might just pack up or get kicked out and go somewhere else and presumably continue being abusive there. I guess it doesn't really solve issues, it just makes the issue someone else's problem.
And this is also another issue that falls prey to that. A lot of the issues we discussed previously in our child sex abuse in the church video sort of apply here as well, but the key one I'm thinking of at the moment is forgiveness. It's very easy for people to play to us oh, I'll change my ways, I'm a good guy, I'll fix this up, I'll repent. And we're like, okay, he seems genuine, wife, you should stay with him and help him to find this forgiveness to change his life around. But so much of the time that is just a show put on for us, just like the abuser does to everyone around the woman, isolating her from everyone. And we fall prey to that sort of thing a lot too easily, I think, and it really hurts the vulnerable among us.
There is also like that doubt in the accusations against the husbands. Like there's one of the stories was about, they brought in the daughter to corroborate the wife's story, to be like, to really figure out whether the husband is abusive. I'm like, well, do you really need to do that? Can't you just believe her from the beginning? This goes out into a whole lot of other things, but that was also one thing of like doubting the woman to begin with.
That's a really complicated one, because like, otherwise blokes are just always guilty no matter what.
Well,
But
the problem
again,
is
it's
domestic,
super complicated.
like sexual assault and abuse, like the reporting rates are very low, and when they do get reported,
They're
the
very
women often
likely
aren't
to be.
believed, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of victim blaming involved. And then if you just look at, say, cases of rape, the percentage that actually result in a conviction are not pessimistically, depressingly small. Like, because you first have to get over the hump of the woman actually reporting it, then the police taking it seriously, or something happening, it getting through the courts, and there's just so many barriers in the face of those who report abuse, and I'm speaking both of women and men here, because there are a similar but somewhat different set of issues that affect men who have been abused.
Oh, for sure. What I'm saying is, it's because of how the legal system works. I'm not saying that you should always dispute absolutely everything. What I'm saying is that because of how the legal system works, which requires certain things, it makes it difficult to move exceptionally quickly. Probably a change, or I'm not sure. I actually don't know what needs to be done there. I'm not any way of an expert on that.
I mean, I understand your point that that the legal system is set up as, innocent until proven guilty, but the problem is that the culture surrounding the legal system, there's a lot of victim blaming.
And even
And
just then,
it's-
it's very hard because your case essentially amounts to he said, she said, normally. It's an act done in private away from others. You don't have, like, a great deal of forensic evidence and weapons and so forth like you would with a murder. So it becomes pretty hard to prove. But yeah, there's, like, when Adam says depressively small, he means it. It's something like sub 5% of cases actually get prosecuted. And that's not even saying anything of the actual quality of the prosecution. Sometimes they just get like community service or other garbage like this for a rape. And it's estimated that only something like 15 to 20% or something of rapes even get reported to begin with, might even be lower. So you've got a very small decimal there for the amount of rapes that actually get prosecuted. Like, innocent until proven guilty is probably the better way to do a legal system, but this is one of its big shortcomings. It's very easy to get away with certain crimes.
Exactly, and it also slows down the response of someone who's in a abusive situation. Like it gives a delay in action, which is, like I said, I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah, it's a bit beyond our scope, I think. But when you're talking
Well,
of church context,
I could talk about my. Oh,
go ahead.
sorry, go. I was going to talk about my experience with domestic violence. So when the big event happened, the police basically issued immediately a DVO, so arrested domestic violence order, and it went straight to the district courts to process this, basically to figure out whether my father got a what's the word, criminal record or not. But I guess that's via the civil civil pathways, whereas this is talking about the church, and I guess that system, there isn't really like any, protocol in place to dealing with this. Maybe the protocol should be, if someone comes to a pastor about domestic violence, then the civil, like the police, should be involved. But it seems like
I
that's
think some
not
churches have
brought
that
up.
already. I think some churches do call the police as part of the protocol.
Yeah, I mean that's great for those churches. But a lot of this story, like a lot of the anecdotes in this article, is about trying to suppress that because it could bring shame to the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, churches are generally very hesitant to do that, even ones that have that sort of protocol. This is changing, I will say, and a lot of new training around this stuff has been brought in. Like, I do it frequently at our church. We have a yearly sort of predominantly child safety, because we work with a lot of children at our church, but also we touch on these other issues as well, what to do with that situation and so forth. But a lot of the troubles arise because, especially once you're at the pastor level, you aren't actually required to, well, once you are ordained, you aren't required to share things that have been told to you about this regard. That's to enable confession and so forth, but that has a lot of problems with it, as the Catholic scandal especially has shown us, that things like the sort of trust placed in us with that we will still protect the vulnerable and look out for the needs of all involved, clearly doesn't always happen.
Yeah, correct me
So
if
we
I'm
need to be a
wrong.
bit more careful with that trust placed in us, I think.
I know in certain professions, it depends on the varying degrees. So some of them are medical, some of them mental health, and I think all day ministers. There's various things they are at liberty to not disclose. But I thought if there was risk of harm to self or others, that there was mandatory. It depends on again. Like I don't know what they are, but I thought there was that. Is there a movement to also include ordained ministers in accessing emergency services and or help services
I
to
was going to
breach
ask the
that
exact same thing.
yeah, breach the confidentiality for the sake of safety?
I haven't heard of one. Like, all I know is they don't have that. And what I've been taught is, as a church member, we do have that. We have mandatory reporting, um, even if
Cool.
it's just to the pastor.
I guess another issue as well is, I mean, I'm not a member of a church, but I gather that, I mean, they're often the community in a person's life, right? They're often very tightly knit. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so if you're essentially reporting, if you consider it like a family, you're essentially reporting on a family member and those who are in positions of power and would be expected to act know both parties, which means they're not impartial.
Yes. And that's one of the, I think the article raised it, if not follow-up pieces have raised it, in that one of the weaknesses is definitely that it's pretty easy for the husbands to hoodwink pastors and that. Because like I'll mention this a bit later too, but one of the issues in a lot of churches is there's very little gender mixing. A male pastor is very likely to know the husband pretty well, but probably has never spoken to the wife for various reasons, and so he's going to have that relationship with the pastor and not the wife, and more inclined to believe the husband.
It depends. I can see where it came from. That obviously is very much depends on congregation.
Yeah, like all this stuff does, and that's part of the.
Yeah,
Actually, there's
but
also
it
a
can
lot of
vary a
issues
lot.
when it comes to um, church and sort of wider culture interaction, is that people seem to think we're this big monolithic thing. Like articles are mentioning, why doesn't the church have national responses set up for this? It's like, because there's like 20 major denominations, and each of them has, if they even have a national body, which isn't a given, then um, they're going to be doing their separate things, and they're not going to be doing a Christianity-wide thing.
And that's why right at the start I made a distinction between talking about what a congregation and what the global church are. They're two different things. So I just clarify that at the start, just because like we're talking about right now, it's not, it can vary. um, I know for the churches I've been part of that there have been professionally trained counselors, and by that I mean secular training, as in like with either certificates or degrees in um, various counseling roles. So I mean they're recognized in the secular workforce at some level, um, which I think is great because it's not like it's some internal, hey, church says you are a counselor person. It's you've actually done training qualification to deal with this. Yeah. So most churches, as far as at least ones I've been part of, do have trained personnel in counselling.
Right, so I've sort of mentioned how disappointed I was with the response to the article and how instead of looking at what we can help like what we can do to change this culture and help the victims, we've been looking at how to defend ourselves as if it's some sort of attack, as if covering up. Actually, let's talk about that a bit more, especially looking at, since we have this other going on at the moment example of the handling of priests' sexual abuse within the Catholic tradition. That's probably a bad way to put it. Within the Catholic Church of Australia, we have numerous examples where, to defend the church's sort of reputation, the priests who have abused children, either in response to their idea of repentance or just to protect the church's reputation, have just been shipped off to other churches, normally far away in the middle of nowhere, where they've just been able to keep abusing children with no repercussions from the organization, and completely all this information withheld from like any outside extra church sort of organization such as the police, where really it should have been reported. Like, this is just wrong. Like, the church reputation, the worst thing for it, like, we can look at this now, the very worst thing that could have happened for the Catholic Church was this, where they've been covering all this up, hurting victims, and then it's discovered. Like, if the church had gone straight away, hey, okay, there's lots of priests abusing kids, help us do something about this, police, it would have been like, oh, look at the church, it's got problems with abuse, and then it would have died down. But now, like, you ask people to associate anything with the Catholic Church, they're going to say, like, child abuse and all this sort of stuff. It's just been way worse for them and the reputation of the church more than that. On top of just the outright ethical arguments of course it's terrible to be covering up abuse for the sake of an institution. That's appalling, and that's the exact opposite of what Jesus was about. He was very much for changing and reforming the institutions of his time. He spoke a lot against the Pharisees and their sort of outward religiosity, while they're doing all this terrible stuff and abusing all these vulnerable people, the widows, like widows and orphans especially. There's big speeches on that, and here we are doing the exact same thing. And as soon as someone raises this issue to us that domestic abuse in churches has often been covered up, or people have been using incorrect assumptions about it and the best ways to deal with it, a lot of people out there have just gone into full defensive mode, attacking the ABC, attacking the journalist who herself is a Christian. I'll repeat, she's a sister. They've just been attacking her and her credibility, all to defend who knows what. Maybe the honor of the church. Maybe they feel God is being attacked in this. Maybe they just like their ideologies, or they've not seen any of this themselves. But so much of the response has been, okay, how can we change? It's been, that's not us. We don't have a problem with that. It's just these guys doing it wrong.
It seems to be, I mean, not isolated to this, but a case where people conflate criticism with an attack or outright condemnation of what they're criticizing. So in this case, the abuse is terrible, and the fact that it hasn't been adequately dealt with is terrible, but those who bring up this fact aren't, like, I guess to use the phrase, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They're just criticizing the response to it. They're not necessarily saying Christianity should be destroyed and never see it again.
Well, I mean, if there's anything to call out, the biblical response is to actually be the ones to call the police and initiate the investigations. Like, if particularly, let's say, a few years ago, or even longer, years and years ago, if the Catholic Church had been proactive, call the police, or it involved the authorities that be to go, hey, you know what, the abuse is happening. We're not going to deny it's happening, and to prove that we don't deny it and to actually do the right thing biblically, just forget about what the legal system says, just biblically do the right thing. We're going to get rid of this, we're going to do our investigation. And if our investigation isn't sufficient, we'll actually invite the Australian police to get involved and clean this out. That would have been the best response. And that would have like, reputation's one thing, but I would sincerely hope that Christians are more like concerned with God's glory and what the Bible says, and rather than a reputation of an entity. You know what I'm saying? It's not a rep thing. It's not like a PR thing. If don't think of it like that. It's right and wrong. Abuse is wrong. Hiding and covering up is wrong too. Like, don't you can't be justified and say, hey, because this one wrong thing has happened, we need to justify covering it up to prevent that wrong thing, hurting reputation. That's just it's just wrong covering wrong. It doesn't solve anything, and the message it sends to people is completely contrary to the Bible we're trying to proclaim.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few institutions which have been able to do internal reviews because they realize something is wrong. So, like the Australian military was doing some reviews on the treatment of females, and like our workplace does reviews on gender balance and gender equity. So, like, if you can, do internal reviews because you acknowledge there's a problem and you want to know how to deal with it in a systematic way. That's a lot better than just trying to believe that there's nothing wrong.
But
cover your ears.
even if like an internal review is seen to be potentially biased, invite the authorities that be if necessary. I think, and if nothing comes up, then great, like great. That's what you want to see. I mean, an investigation that when you hear so and so has been investigated, it may mean, okay, there's a chance of something being dodgy. But if nothing comes up, says investigation clear, that's actually a boost to the reputation of whatever's investigated. You know what I mean? There's nothing high investigations, generally speaking, at least in the long term, maybe not short term, because the news loves to say, you've been investigated. In the long term, it's good, I thought.
We've mentioned I mentioned this before tonight as well, at least something similar, but these are systematic issues, and so in criticizing organizations for inadequate responses and for not properly caring for the victims, such action on parts of the organization doesn't have to come from malice. It can come from ignorance, not to defend. If it's a complex situation and not everyone knows how to handle abuse, or when confronted, or when someone comes up to you and asks for support, it's like we need to train people so that they can understand how to handle these situations and send them to those better qualified. And so we're also making an argument to improve the systems in place.
Alright, so let's talk a bit about some of the things that we can do. And some of that stuff has been started, like pretty sure it was the I can't remember the denomination, so I won't just say one that I think it is, but some denominations have been working on this. This problem was either revealed or they just realized this shortcoming a while ago, and they've started all manner of surveys and so forth to start developing a training program for domestic violence and what can be done about it for their pastors and, well, students at their Bible colleges essentially, who will one day become pastors or missionaries or just educated laymen. So you've got some churches out there are doing this sort of thing. So now if you've got me on Facebook, you've probably seen this already, but I have written a couple of things on what I think the response should have been. So I'll sort of go over some of those now. Like I mentioned before, this isn't something we should be ignoring as part of a church or going, oh, that's not in our own church, because that's part of the problem that the article raises. But especially, I think it was 7.2% of nominal, like the nominal Christians, nominal conservative Christians in that US study, it was 7.2% I think were abusing their wives. That's a very high percentage. Like, that's 7 out of every 100 husbands you know have a chance of being abusing husbands. Obviously that won't be evenly distributed. Certain churches will have more than others for various reasons, stuff like that, but this is likely to be something that you've come across, something within your church, happened to people you know. It's not a small thing. So let's get rid of that idea that it's something that happens out there and realize that it's something that we will probably see in our lives, something we will encounter, something that we need to, at the very least, prepare for. So the main takeaway I saw, and we'll actually be doing this a bit later, is that they use these verses to control. The submit to your husbands verses especially, and even on top of that, the pastors who make the poor choices with how to handle it and try and keep the women and the families together, which can be well-meaning, I will say, but it's misguided. They also use another verse that we'll be looking at about how God hates divorce. But the best thing we can do to help these women to know that it's not they're not serving God by staying in these relationships. This isn't what God wants for them. The husband doesn't have this authority over you. You can get out of it. Is we can teach them the proper meaning of these verses that these abusers will use. We can cover them more often. We can make sure that, for one, we can make sure that the church is a comfortable place where we can discuss difficult verses and not have to try and hide and always try and be theologically perfect. There's some hard verses out there, hard to understand, and that say some hard things. Let's become a place where we can discuss those. And let's teach on them more. Often these are avoided because they are hard, or because they might be damaging for some people's faith. Well, what's worse for their faith is to have twisted interpretations of these verses put to them, or just have to struggle through them on their own, not having any idea what to make of them. That's often a lot worse than discussing these things. So the second thing that came up in the article is that we have to become a place that's more welcoming to divorcees, to widows, to single mothers, like that sort of thing. Like, often these people are looked down on. We consider them to be of questionable character, to have got into this situation, to have made some bad choices, to think they're a bad influence, stuff like this. Often these women are just victims of circumstance. They simply fell afoul to the honeyed words and the terrible character of a selfish man. And that's something that could have happened to anyone judging people like this. And even if they did make bad choices and get into that relationship at the beginning and that they were of questionable character, that's the core of our religion, is built around that we're all of questionable character. We've all made these poor choices, we've all done terrible things against each other, against God, and that Jesus sacrificed himself to clear that away, to give us a new life and to guide us. He resurrected to life to guide us in that way and help us come back to God and be a kingdom under God. Like, it shouldn't matter to us what someone... Right, I've argued against this a bit before, but it should matter a bit of what someone has done in the past. You don't want to be completely blind to someone being a child abuser or a wife beater or what have you. You want to keep that in mind and be a bit cunning with that and what you let them do. But we shouldn't ostracize people just because they've been through a divorce, just because they're a single mother with no father for their children, or hey, a mother with different fathers for their children. All this is stuff that you might see. It's stuff that we have a lot of in our church, since we're in a sort of more difficult area for that sort of thing. Like, these people are the ones who most need our love and support. They most need the help of the church. If you think, oh, well, maybe they're a bad influence on our children, well, think about their children too. It takes a community to raise a child. Do what you can. Like, I know a guy who does youth group, and he makes particular attention to look out for those kids who are from single mother, to make sure that they have that sort of male role model in their life. That's something we can all do to try and make sure that these kids have someone in their life to sort of cover these weaknesses, and not to just shame these people and keep them away from our good, pure selves. It's just so damaging and so anti-Christian. Like, if we want to be a place where women can be open about divorce, about abuse, and then leave their abusers, we have to not ostracize and shame them when they do leave them, to always label them and keep them on the outside. And the final thing is, we need to be a place where anyone, man or woman, can access what the church has to offer. So, like, part of this, and something the article raised that I think was probably a bit of a misstep, was arguing for more women pastors and so forth. Ultimately, that's also going to be a bit of a problem, in that most churches only have a single pastor. There's not a whole lot of large churches out there with a pastoral team. So likely, whatever church you're in, the pastor has like the pastor is likely to be of the other gender to you. So how do we get around that? Well, we make sure that our churches are places where anyone can go to any gender pastor or any gender person in the congregation about this stuff. They don't have to be worried because the pastor's a man to raise this issue. They should know that the pastor will be understanding and will listen to them and not think less of them, and that will be approachable for them as a woman. And part of the church's response to that should also be to not sort of do the usual gossip and so forth. Oh, look at the pastor meeting secretly with a woman. That must be having an affair. Maybe he's talking to her about abusive husband, that sort of thing. We can't continue this sort of slander and thinking the worst of every situation if we want men and women to be able to engage right in our church and not think it's romantic every time, which is part of the issue with a lot of this springs from, in that people seem to think that the only time men and women interact, this is in conservative, I should add, the only time men and women interact is when there's romantic interest between them. Who would want to talk to a man or a woman otherwise? And even pastors sometimes have these sort of bad ideas around this sort of stuff. Like, I think it was the Vice President of America recently got into a bit of hot water after saying, oh, he doesn't have dinner with women because that could be seen as inappropriate, or that could be too tempting, or whatever his sort of excuse was. That's something we get in churches too. Men and pastors just completely avoid talking to women because they think it might be temptation. like, get a hold of yourself. Show proper restraint and show respect when talking to women. There's a lot more to them than a sex object. If you want to show the respect to women that Jesus showed, to be a Christian family, we've got to recognize we're brothers and sisters, not just men and women. We've got to think of each other properly about this stuff, and we've got to learn how to get on with each other to make sure that any gender in the church can sort of discuss things like this. And if when women feel they can approach their pastor or approach men in the church about these sort of issues, it's going to make things a whole lot better, because this abuse will come to light. They'll be able to get that support even if they don't know that many people in the church, or the people they know are of a different gender. Not to mention just the effects that these sort of views around men and women can have in a church to begin with, and can help perpetrate this sort of abuse. But anyway, so what do other people think? What did other people sort of take away from the article, the responses we should have?
I think that's a pretty good summary from, at least from my stand on it.
Yeah. I mean, you said that you're going to talk about the verses in particular that a lot of men or abusers cite. So, which is the whole "wives submit your husbands" line. When I first heard that, which was at a Christian wedding, I was taken back. Well, there was a whole
You've moved away
section
from the mic.
of that
We just
article.
missed that bit.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. There was a whole section of the article, like, analyzing the interpretation of that. Because when I first heard that, I was taken aback, because it sounds like, oh, you submit and basically, you know, do as your husband says. But I guess there's more context to it. But some people choose to ignore that context. So I'll be interested to talk about those verses more, unless that's for a different episode.
Well, that's next, if no one else has anything to say.
I mean, on relation to the lessons to take away and things to improve, I mean, put succinctly, just listen to those that listen to victims, and don't have your first response be doubting what they're saying. And if you're not in a position to handle it, then make sure you have resources on hand to suggest to give them aid. I mean, tonight I've been discussing like organizations as a whole, because these are structural problems in society, not isolated to churches of any religion. But I mean, you'll find such issues of abuse, I mean, maybe not necessarily domestic violence, but sexual assault in, companies and universities and all sorts of organizations. And just listen to victims and understand that there are structural issues at play and power dynamics that complicate things.
All right. So, I've got to switch sources here, so hopefully this doesn't mess things up too much. But let's get into the sort of looking at these verses bit. So first, it's worth discussing the male headship sort of thing. I'll just make sure this hasn't cut out. Okay, we've still got audio, we're all good. Male headship sort of doctrine, complementarianism, egalitarian, these are words that have thrown around a lot, and they're probably the root of a lot of people's defensiveness around this article. So you've sort of got two rough branches of Christian thought on married sort of relationships, or just, I suppose it's only really married relationships, but it does affect who can be a pastor and so forth. You've got the egalitarian position, which is pretty similar to society at large, in that men and women are completely equal, and normally to the point of where they say there's no differences between men and women in what they're good at, what jobs, like what church jobs and whatever they can do, and what the relationship and who should be the leader in the marriage looks like. Then you've got complementarian, which is the idea that men and women are different. They were created by God differently, equal, like equal dignity. They still believe men and women are equal, but different. And so there's different roles that are suited for them and certain roles that aren't allowed to women, such as ministry. And it's expected of the husband to be the leader in the relationship. We will be looking at those verses later because those ones are the ones most used by abusers. But generally, conservatives fall on the complementarian side, and a lot of the other churches, the less conservative, the sort of the mainline to liberal, tend to fall on the egalitarian side. Like the Baptist churches that me and Jacob are a part of mostly fall on the egalitarian side. Though it's difficult because it's sort of like I wouldn't really call myself egalitarian because I do think there are innate differences between men and women in skills and talents, but I don't think that should shape roles within that or jobs that are open to women and so forth. So I'm not egalitarian enough to say that there's no difference between men and women, but not complementarian enough to say that those differences restrict us.
Yeah, I mean, it's on my spot. I mean, I don't really, I'm not really good at labeling myself. I just hope I'm true to Bibleitarian, whatever that one's called. Uh, in the sense that I'm more than happy to hear sermons from female pastors, no problem. Although I mean, I think it's pretty obvious there's differences between men and women physiologically in many different ways, you know, particularly mentally in their about stuff. That shouldn't stop anything. Instead, should allow men and women to complement each other very well. That's basically where I stand on it. I don't really have any super complicated view on it.
Right, so I've just pulled up one of the verses here, and I've actually managed to get all of it, which is nice. So Ephesians 5:21 to 25. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he is the Saviour. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I think I have missed a couple of verses here. Just as the church gave himself up to her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing of water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain, wrinkle, or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. And some more. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. So, for we are members of his body, and that's all of it, talking about Christ. So often, like verse 22 is loved by abusers. It comes up in that article, and it comes up in every article and story you read about abuse by Christians. Yet here we have the one straight before it. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So this is a big part of the egalitarian point of view, by the way, that we are all to submit to each other. So we're all in that equal position of submission to each other. That's sort of what it's getting at here. Like just as wives submit to their husbands should submit to their wives. That's the biblical basis of the egalitarian point of view. Whereas these verses are more the basis of the sort of complementarian point of view, where the husband is to be the head of, just as Christ is the head of the church, the husband is the head of the wife and by extension the family. He should be the leader, and the wife should follow and support him in what he does. But it's also got these qualifying verses, including the sort of the bit addressed to husbands. Love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Now, Christ didn't react to the church, to the apostles, to his followers by abusing them, by forcing them to follow him, to submit. Christ loved the church and loved the people he came to by dying for them. He taught them, lovingly instructed them, forgave them, and then did everything he could to make us holy. He took that death on the cross to make us holy. The husband is supposed to have that love, not a dominating love, and indeed instructions. Jesus says of his apostles, this is how they will know you, that you love each other, that you put each other first in what you do. So that's the sort of love a Christian husband is meant to have, to do everything they can for their wife, to make them holy, to make sure that everything they need is met. And this sort of key, sort of real useful verse, not just for marriages, but just for life in general, to treat everyone else. It's sort of, I guess it's the sort of basis of that, treat others as you would like to be treated, saying we have in that the way you would treat your own body is how you should treat those around you, or especially in this case, your wife. Like, you don't see abusers beating up their own body to make it submit. No, they just tend to follow it and do whatever. And this is probably part of the difference that we see between those irregular church attenders and the sort of regular church attenders, because the irregular ones might just see this part and not see or hear about the clarifications of any of this part. They know wives should submit to their husbands as you do to the Lord, but they don't know enough about Jesus to know what leading in the same way that he did means to them. So, to clarify this a little bit more with what this passage actually means, as I said, there's mutual submission among Christians. Submission's actually had a pretty bad rap in every culture. It has one in ours, and a lot of cultures tend to, including the Greco-Roman culture of the time, tend to focus on pride, sort of be proud of what you can achieve, do your own will as much as you can, that sort of thing. But the Bible is full of teachings on submission. We're to submit to authorities, we're to submit to Christ, we're to place God in top spot in our lives and take his judgment above our own. We're to submit to authorities because God has put them there and given them the sword, given them like the powers of punishment that they have for the right ordering of, I wish I could word it right, I've forgotten the actual wording, but he's given them the powers of the sword for good reason. We're to submit to authorities, we're to submit to leaders in the church, we're to submit to each other, we're to love one another before ourselves. All these sort of ideas of putting yourself last, essentially, submitting your own wills and desires to what is best for those around you, and what is best and what God has said is best. So this means wives, do whatever your husband says, or you're being a bad wife, you're dishonoring the Lord. This is wives, you're supposed to submit to your husbands just as your husbands are submitting to you, just as they're loving you and just as they're looking for you, look as Christ looks for you, just as you would submit to authority, and just as the church does, and so forth. That's the sort of submission here. It's not forced, it's voluntary, and it's a submission for the benefit of all involved, not for one involved. And it's always sort of to this goal of making us holy, that is, making us sort of as bringing us to the shape and to the way of living that God wants of us, to get our mind, our heart, and our actions in line with the way God created humanity to live. And there's sort of caveats that come with submission in a couple of places, like we're to submit to authorities, and yet we're not to submit to, like some of the historical examples, we're not to, for example, worship idols at the behest of authorities. When sort of the Romans, well, the Greeks actually, the Seleucid Greeks, tried to enforce the Jews to worship their God instead of the one true God we follow, the Jews were considered to be right in resisting that, in sticking to God rather than following the whims of authority. And similarly, in the treatment of a lot of people, of the oppressed, of the widows, and so forth, Christians were required to uphold that, to try and make things better for these people, rather than to just go with whatever society has said it right. There's certain principles of following God that we're to place above even following authorities. And this also goes in terms of marriage and submission there. You're to follow God above your husband. If your husband is doing things, or especially making you do things that God would not approve of, you have a responsibility to God there, not to your husband. And you can even take it as when your husband is not upholding his end of the bargain. I suppose when he's not upholding his God-given mandate to love your wife as he does his own body, and is abusing her and so forth, that's not a marital relationship anymore. You've got this, he's broken the contract essentially. You're not even bound to submit to him anymore because he has no love and care for you. He's not being he's not doing his job. So why should you follow a man like that into that era? Anyone got anything to add on the Ephesians verse?
No, actually, I think that's a pretty good summary of it. That's actually quite good. Not even summary, that goes into a few different things there.
It's nice to
honestly,
hear all of it.
yeah. I don't honestly. What I think would be helpful as well. I mean, given I'm not married by any means, I can't really offer anything practical to any practical context of what that verse looks like. Although I think that'd be quite helpful to, I guess, add to this discussion, or it would be a here's the context what that actually looks like practically. Obviously, you have good examples of what that looks like, but just from that in action, I think would be really helpful too. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately I fall into the same problem there of not being in a relationship and not having been in a particularly well-functioning family myself growing up, so I don't have examples to give. But I think a lot of the abuses are clear. And that's what I think a lot of people have gotten wrong with their sort of whole defensiveness around this submission idea based in this article. I completely forgot my point just then. They've been busy. No, it's totally gone. I had it like 2 seconds ago. Too
It's
busy
okay, you
trying to
have
work out
editing
which
software
next.
now, so you can just see a point later when you remember it and edit it in as if it was always that just edit out me saying this, and I'll just say, that's a great point, Jesse. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay, I just remembered. We've been real busy
Seamless.
focusing on the proper sort of understanding of these verses, defending against, like arguing about what submission means and so forth. I think we can all pretty clearly agree on what submission doesn't mean. It's pretty easy to,
Stopping abuse is
um,
not submission.
yeah, when you've got abuse of the sort of degree that the article is mentioning and so forth happening, like, no one's gonna, no, like, no true Scotsman is going to mention that, is not going to think that that's the right interpretation of this verse. This isn't the sort of situation that happened in the Islam article where it actually says things that you can, if you take directly literally, is okay, you're allowed to hit your wife. I'm not qualified to talk on those verses about Islam. I don't know anything about it, but if you've read that other article, you would have, in the series, you would have come across that. This is, we should all be able to come together as Christians, whatever we think about the submission here, to condemn that this use of it for violence is not that, and we should focus on that rather than arguing about what this actually means at this time. The other similar verse, there's a verse in 1 Corinthians that's very similar to this. I don't know it well enough and I don't want to spend the time searching for it here, but it's got that same sort of gist of wives, submit to your husbands, the husband is the head of the wife, as the Christ is of the church, etc. It's very similar to that, so just sort of apply the same things there. Now the other one from the article it mentioned is 1 Timothy 2, 11 to 12 is the one in the article. Let's guess here, 8 to, I don't know, 16. We'll probably go past the chapter break there. Yeah, it's 15 chapters. And these are actually really difficult ones, Timothy, that I don't have full answers for. So I'll just read out what we've got here. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbirth if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So these are probably some of, like in my opinion, the hardest and some of the worst verses in the whole Bible. Like what is going on here, there's all manner of things that I could quite easily see being condemned later in sort of literature, such as, like what happened with the Old Testament, people would have one interpretation of things that the later prophets then condemned. They were like, no, you guys, you got it wrong. Like this is the sort of thing I can see here, but this is one of the latest books we have. A bit of background, Timothy is it's from Paul, presumably. I'm not sure if it actually states it's from Paul. Some of them don't. To Timothy, who is sort of his understudy, talking about how Paul thinks churches should be ordered. Very specifically, this is in 1st century, mostly Greek sort of areas, Greco-Roman cultures. And this is how he sees that churches should be run here. He wants the men to pray with holy hands lift without anger or disputing. The women, like he doesn't actually condemn sort of elaborate clothing or so forth. It's don't focus on that. Don't focus on your outward displays of wealth or your fancy hairstyles, which is what this sort of thing is. Like jewelry and fancy hairstyles were not as common in the ancient world as they are now. You should instead be sort of showing yourself by your good deeds. And it's worth noting here that modesty also means it's more akin to properly in line with culture, in the way things have been done sort of traditionally. Not really traditionally, but like I can't really find the word here. But the idea is not so much about modesty, about having the right bits covered and so forth. The idea is around appropriateness, how you'll be perceived by others and so forth. Dress in a way that that others will perceive you well and not think badly of you based on the sort of cultural norms and so forth of the time. So the things that you might be able to wear these days in a modern Western context and still be thought of as dressing appropriately are probably, well, are definitely very different to how that would have been seen in Greco-Roman culture at the time. So now the bit used by abusers here: a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. There's a whole lot of different views on this and how it interacts with Greek, especially culture at the time. Is this about ordering of church services? Or is there a particularly vocal, uneducated group of women in a particular church that was disrupting things that he's writing more about? Would this just be a barrier to people joining the church if they go into here and they're these crazy places of, as they see it, anarchy? It's hard to tell. Same with the head coverings, which is actually the element of the 1 Corinthians verse that doesn't, and I might try and find it because there is a bit to say about that. Actually, it's not relevant, I won't talk about it. But suffice it to say, the head coverings is to do with culture. It was sort of a way of showing that a woman was married. It was equivalent to, for a woman to have a covered head is kind of equivalent to wearing a wedding ring these days. The people were stopping to do it in church. It's almost as if we're going to church and, okay, women, leave your wedding ring at the door. It doesn't matter in here. It's true, your status as married or not married doesn't particularly matter in a church before God, just as having your head covered or not doesn't matter before God, but it tends to leave a pretty wrong impression on all involved if you just throwing your wedding rings off the instant you get into a church. And the forbidment on covering men is probably to do with culture. Greek priests, the men had like a sort of hooded robe get up. Not how you probably picture a hooded robe given Western fantasy, but the point is they had a covered head and a hood. In this culture, if you're doing these things, such as women not having their head covered and men having their head covered, you might be giving the wrong impression of what your church is actually about, that it's some sort of pagan worship center full of orgies, which is actually complaints that were leveled against Christians early in the Roman times when they were being persecuted. They're full of orgies and incests, all these brothers and sisters getting together, they eat flesh there, talking about the communion, stuff like that. So we can see a pretty practical outworking that these weren't just idle sort of worries, these sort of thing actually did happen through cultural misunderstanding. Because it's hard to see in a Western culture these days that's been shaped around Christianity for 2 centuries, but at the time it was incredibly radical, very distinct from any other culture at the time, and so it stood out a lot and caused a lot of misinterpretations. But anyway, back to quietness and full submission. Like, if I'm being entirely honest, I don't really know what to make of this passage. This latter part is sometimes interpreted as talking to a sort of prophecy that women and indeed men will be saved or were saved through childbearing, in that Mary bore Jesus, who saved us all. But then you've got this bit: if they continue in love, holiness, and propriety. women should learn in quietness and full submission. Ultimately, that's probably something that's normally thought to be appropriate for all Christians. Like, you don't. Some churches, obviously, there's a lot more vocalization and so forth from the congregation than others, but generally, quiet and respect to the person who's speaking is generally considered appropriate. Permitting women to teach and assume authority. I've seen arguments that this is to do with education. Women in the classical world were almost always not educated, whereas men generally were. It could be related to that. It's hard to say. But the other important thing to recognize about all these verses is that Bible verses don't stand out on their own. They're part of 66 books that altogether give us a complete picture. And when you see one verse saying something, and then other verses that say something quite different, for example, that women here are saved if they bring up Christian children, we know that is not the case from many other places. Women, like all believers, are saved through faith in Jesus Christ. It's got nothing to do with that, and indeed, the verse I reference a fair bit, like, in Christ there is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, man nor woman, but all are. I can't remember the last part of it, but the point is it makes all these comparisons and says all are equal in Christ, all are saved in the same way. There's no difference between God of all these people. So whatever verse 15 means, it doesn't mean that women are only saved through having Christian babies.
One of the views on that, well, verses in relation to Genesis 3, talking about the descendant that will crush the head of the snake. Essentially, it's the role of humanity being fulfilled by Jesus. It potentially relates to Genesis 3. That's one way of looking at it, which is saying from female a Savior will be born. That is one view of that. Again, I'm not a theologian, but it's a view that explains a meaning from the verse that doesn't contradict anything else in the Bible. So, Jesse, what's your thoughts on that?
Generally not a fan of all the whole serpent crusher sort of theories. I think they're overly elaborate and are putting a lot of pieces in place. I guess it's my science background, but I tend to use a lot of Occam's razor on biblical theories and think, okay, this has to have been relevant to the culture it was written for one. God wouldn't just write these little incomplete bits that all are only of any worth when you combine them all together. It's got to have that meaning there, and it's not normally got to be overly complex. Like, that's just my general view of it. But yeah. Also, this section here, 13 and 14, because Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not the one deceived; it was a woman. Like, Adam shares fully in Eve's punishment, and like, God does not just punish Eve for being deceived. He punishes Adam as well for, like, we don't even fully know, other than the fact that they ate from the tree of forbidden knowledge, essentially, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We don't know the specifics of why they were punished, but it's worth noting that it's not as if Adam was innocent in it all. He was complicit, and he was punished equally for that.
Oh, for sure.
So, like, I don't know what these passages mean. I don't know what they are. It's worth noting, like, an important takeaway here is that the Timothy letters are pretty unique in that they are very specific letters written to a specific person about the ordering of a church in a specific time period. The rest of the letters that we have in the New Testament aren't like that normally. They contain directions to some churches in specific cultures, and sometimes they're pretty specific with the issues they're dealing with, but they aren't sort of trying to lay out these sort of plans going forward. And indeed, we don't fully know that that's what this is either. This could have just been Timothy wrote to Paul asking, hey, I want to start a church here. What are some guidelines I should follow? What's some advice here? We're unfortunately missing a
Another thought
lack of
is,
context around these letters, and in some cases, even some of the letters themselves. Just time has
it,
worn
it,
away
it,
at
it
the.
sorry, it's possible that it could be a maybe very personal thing to Timothy in particular for not mentioning names, but this may apply to some people in church not mentioning names. I don't know. These verses have always been difficult for me to understand exactly what the meaning of is. General picture, yep, okay, but the exact understanding of how it all fits together, I've I've never really felt like I've understood it completely.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. But basically, what it doesn't say, a woman learning in quietness and full submission, doesn't mean she has to submit in everything, even abuse to a husband,
Oh,
be
absolutely
completely
not.
quiet
No.
all the time, so
I
forth.
think in terms of tonight's topic, like there's absolutely no wiggle room in a you should put up with abuse. I don't think that's anywhere substantiated. Like so, in terms of what we're talking tonight, that is a very well covered thing.
All right, now let's go on to probably on the last verse we'll cover tonight. If other people have verses that they want sort of analyzed or so forth, then feel free to comment them, and I'll have a look through them and see what I can say on them, stuff like that. Make some videos about it, that sort of thing. If people think there's stuff I didn't cover, that sort of thing. Feel free to comment and leave recommendations and so forth. But back to the last one we'll be looking at tonight, Malachi 2:14 to 17. This one from the Old Testament, so the sort of pre-Christian, the pre-Jesus part of the book, whereas those other two were from the New Testament, the after Jesus part of the Bible. Probably should have been explaining things a bit more here, but from Malachi 2:14 is the one on divorce that's often used um, to keep wives in abusive situations. So the context is because of um, the ancient nation of Israel's, because of the things that they've been doing against God and the corruptness of their society. God's put various punishments on them. And here in 14 it kicks off with, "You ask, why? It is because the Lord is the witness between you and the wife of your youth. You have been unfaithful to her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. Has not the one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. So be on your guard, and do not be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. The man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect, says the Lord Almighty. So be on your guard and do not be faithful."
To be unfaithful.
So a bit of cultural background here for one. Well, first I'll just talk about our what's called the immediate context of the passage in that the verses around it. So people just pull out verse 16, God hates divorce, or have I actually got? Yes, I have an alternate translation down here. I hate divorce, says the Lord, because the man who divorces his wife covers his garment with violence. So this verse here, often pulled out, God hates divorce, is used. Okay, you should just don't divorce. Doesn't matter how terrible your marriage is, how much violence is committed against you, don't do it because God hates it. All we have to do is look at the second half of the chapter, the second half of that verse, to see how wrong that is. Does violence to the one he should protect. That's the main problem with the divorce here, is that the act of divorce is violence against the wife. Right, I'll just clarify. I'll get into that right now. So ancient cultures, resources were scarce, people were poor, you didn't have big central governments, especially in this, like this is in Israel, a small country, middle of nowhere, mostly made up of farming villages, though it did have a king. This is not a big empire like later Rome was when they started being able to have rudimentary social services and so forth going. This is just a small, poor country of farmers. So there was no social security, there was no security net. If you could not work, you would basically starve because no one could afford to look after you. You sort of had to live off charity as beggars. And even if you could work, often you had to do stuff like that. Women generally couldn't work, often simply just because they weren't able to do the work. This isn't a day of tractors and horse plows even. You'd be lucky to even have an oxen plow, which is less effective than a horse plow. Um, you just you had to work the soil, the hard soil by hand. You had to grow what you could. And often that just wasn't even if a woman could acquire land and purchase land somehow, she was unlikely to be able to work it. That's why the Bible has particular focus on widows and orphans when it talks about mistreating the poor, because the widows, um, without a man or a family to help provide for them, simply couldn't. Same as the children, they were as unable to work as the orphaned children. These people are sort of left from this. Now, when a man divorces his wife, he's condemning her to that fate. He's just saying, nope, I don't want you anymore. I don't care if anyone's going to look after you. Don't care if you starve. Be gone. Often it's just, it goes down to, I want a prettier wife or a younger wife or whatever. So the divorce here isn't saying that God wants all families together all the time. He's essentially just saying, I want to make sure that these people are looked after. I don't want women starving. Like we can see some examples of this from an earlier period with the whole issue around Abraham and Hagar and Sarah, where we see part of Abraham's righteousness in that he does not want to divorce Hagar, who was essentially just a slave that due to Babylonian sort of cultural laws, he was himself Babylonian before leaving. And Sarah's suggestion that to try and get an heir through, because Sarah herself was barren, to try and get an heir, he had sex with Hagar, Sarah's handmaid, and produced a child with her. Then things went chaotic because polygamy is actually not good. There's a reason it's condemned, and it works out pretty terrible for families. I did a study on that in the Bible one time. It bears that through. You see these families fail a lot more. Well, in all cases except one, which we barely even hear about. But point being, Abraham was hesitant to do this to Sarah, and it was only after God sort of intervened and said, hey, I'll look after Hagar, I'll provide for her and her son in the wilderness. Just do what your wife wants, keep her happy. And so that's how they get set off. And you see that things are pretty hard for them. Like, they stumble around in the desert and things are pretty bad. God provides them a fountain, a well, provides them water, and he grows Ishmael up to be a mighty hunter, doing all he can to provide for them. And it's still a hard life for them. Also, the book of Ruth gives you an example of this context. We see Ruth and Naomi are sort of reduced to begging and to just sort of gleaning the edges of fields. So looking after fields of farmers for anything that they've missed after they've gone through and harvested. That's like picking through weeds and that to get food to make a bit of bread is what these two widows were reduced to. And a big part of the story is over how Boaz sort of helps her out of that situation and eventually marries her. So, long tangent there on history and the proofs for it, but point being, divorce now is very different to divorce then. And even divorce then, there's times when it was appropriate, like Jesus says of divorce in the New Testament. Ideally, there would be no divorce. like paraphrasing, ideally there would be no divorce, but because of your hard hearts, i.e. because of the sort of, because you don't follow God's way, essentially, is the way of that, and because you don't love each other, so forth, your heart is hardened to both to your God and to those around you. Moses gave you the institute of divorce. So this institute has been a part of Jewish culture and is still a part of now, and it has good reasons to be because people aren't perfect. To use this one passage, aside from the dangers in not ever using a single passage for anything, it's pretty obvious here that the point of the passage is not against the divorce in and of itself, it's against the act of violence against a wife, against one you should protect. Not to mention the unfaithfulness and so forth that leads to it up here. But even just focusing on the divorce is okay at times. Divorce is a way of avoiding violence, of escaping violence, of returning to a safe situation. It exists for a reason, and it can be used for that reason. Jesus is okay with it. He'd prefer it's not, things weren't that way, but because it is that way, that's why we have these institutions, that's why it's okay. To use divorce to get away from wives, and sometimes pastors, it's okay to recommend divorce to prevent this violence done to the wife. Alright, so that's about all I have to say on it. Anyone got anything to add?
I certainly can't add anything to the historical religious context, but I guess the takeaway points is that you can't you can't take these passages or the Bible out of context because so much of the meaning is wrapped up in the context.
I fully agree. Also, this particular passage, to the Timothy one at least, I think is one of the most difficult to read in context passages. Most other passages in the Bible are quite easy to understand in the context. That's just one particularly difficult one. And the vast majority are much easier to understand. So yeah.
Yeah, as I said, hardest passage in the whole Bible, those ones for working out meaning. It makes Genesis and Revelation look easy.
Yep. So that's for me. I mean, again, I'm not a theologian at all, so yeah. But I don't have anything to add. Honestly, overall, I think there's a lot of content that's been said in the last while, 2.5 hours. So yeah. I guess my summary point is, look, the church should be transparent and prayerfully be found transparently following God's word. That's all I have to say.
So just go on.
Oh, I disagree with everything else. That context is important. You can't really take the words at face value, which is difficult for a lot of people, but it's necessary.
Yeah, so just some takeaway points for people reading through these verses and sort of studying them. Well, I guess the first one is it's okay to not know what they mean. To talk and discuss hard things. That's why we have things like Bible studies every week, to go through and help people understand this stuff and to discuss the things we find hard. And things such as doubt, such as uncertainty about passages and different interpretations of this stuff is okay. Like, there's a limit on different interpretations and still being Christian, as we're calling out abusers for, but that's there. And just sort of specifically to anyone in an abusive situation or anyone who might be and is not sure of this, I guess just the sort of takeaway points here are these verses don't mean you have to stay in that. Regardless of what anyone tells you about them, these verses and the rest of the Bible are very clearly against abuse.
And covering up abuse.
Yeah, against covering up abuse, against perpetrating abuse, and it's not against divorce. Like, I remember one pretty sort of anecdotal bit here. one pretty cool bit of my Christian experience was one Bible study one night when I don't even remember how he got on it, but sort of divorce came up, and me and another guy and a girl in the group all sort of were talking about like we're children of divorce, and for us it was a good thing. It was a good thing that our mothers left that situation that they were in, that they had that divorce, and it was, we think of it as better in the long run for our families and for everyone involved. So if you're stuck in that situation, especially if you're a mother with kids who's worried about the impact of divorce on your kids, sure, it sucks at the start and there's a lot of difficulties and so forth, but generally it's like, at least for serious cases and so forth, like whether it's not just physical abuse, verbal abuse, that sort of thing, it's better to be away from that situation. Like the three of us, all young adults now, we're able to look back and say, you know what? Yeah, our mothers did the right thing here. They got us away from that, and they really helped us to develop as a family and to develop as people. It was for the best overall that we had this divorce and didn't try and stay together as a family. All right. Well, that's all we've got for tonight. Hope you
I think
all
that's
got
almost a
something out of
solid
it.
2 hours, isn't it, Jesse?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2.5.
I think so, yeah.
We started at 8:30, basically.
As I said, I've got a lot to say on this topic. But yeah, thank you for joining us and sticking through to the end if you are hearing this. We'll see you all next time.
Yeah,
See ya.
thank you for tuning in,
Bye.
and I guess we'll leave some resources for domestic violence in wherever Jesse posts this.
Sounds great.